Zapraszamy pana doktora Mccarthy'ego. Dr. Mccarthy, we are in your hands.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be back in Krakow after many years away. I apologize for my lack of Polish. You have a late translation. There may be some problems with the translation, which could be sorted out at the question and answer session, I hope. Thank you. This paper has a few additional parts in English, but the translation hopefully will capture the most of the paper for you. On the 30th of September 2013, Nathan Verhelst, a 44-year-old Belgian transsexual originally named Nancy, was killed at her, or his, own request by lethal injection administered by Wim Distelmans, a 60-year-old physician. Verhelst's mother confirmed the claim made by Nancy Nathan that she was an unwanted child, a fact which deeply scarred her throughout her life, and was referred to shortly before the end. Nancy's mother told Het Laatste News after the lethal injection was performed that, "When I first saw Nancy, my dream was shattered. She was so ugly. I had a ghost birth. Her death does not bother me," adding, "For me, this chapter is closed. I feel no sorrow, no doubt, or remorse. We never had a bond, which could therefore not be broken." This story, which provoked much shock and unease on publication, helps to reveal the terminal point of an ideology, or family of ideologies, which is prevalent in much of the developed world. It is the purpose of the first part of this talk to examine these ideologies at some length before talking a little of the social consequences of them for my own country, England, which sadly has an influence on the world disproportionate to her economic strength and size of population. The story just mentioned concerns such matters as our relationship to the body, sex change operations, suicidality, euthanasia, and family bonds. Shocking as the case is to any decent person, involving an unusually heartless mother, it is most shocking when seen against the background of a broad metaphysical worldview of a more realist kind, one which is increasingly being rejected, at least in the Western world, in areas such as academe, popular culture, government policy, and consequently amongst more people than ever before in the history of mankind. When Nancy's mother denied her bond to the child, she cannot literally have meant the physical bond which allowed for the accepted use of the term mother in this instance. For like it or not, Nancy came into the world as a member of the human species, and like most of us, was born into a family. She was an individual, and as H.W. Fowler's classic grammar book, The King's English, reminds us, an individual necessarily relates to a whole, and is not simply a synonym for person. She was not merely a member of a class, in the sense in which a film cataloguer might classify a particular film with certain properties as belonging to a particular genre. Her belonging was not a matter of resembling certain other individuals in a set, but rather her being part of a whole. As Herbert McCabe puts it, talking about the human species, the species does not exist because there are many individual animals which resemble each other. Rather, the contrary. Any individual exists because there is a species from which it can be born. Individuals belong to a logical class by grace of the observer. They belong to a species by grace of their parents. It is fundamental to the theory of human ethics we are considering that mankind is not just a logical class, but a species constituted by relationships amongst its members. Narrowing our focus, we can say that Nancy started life in the body of her mother, already in a network of given, non-voluntarist, non-instrumental goods. By non-voluntarist goods, I mean simply goods that have not been chosen by us, like who our biological parents are, and the nature of their biological role with regard to us. Note that everything I'm saying about Nancy is focused on her bodily nature. She did not come to be in the body of her mother as a ghost in a machine, a spirit in search of a body of her own. To have aborted Nancy would have been especially wrong, because it would have been the taking of her biological life in a biological environment uniquely fitted to her nurture as a human being. Indeed, it is precisely in these biological contexts that we encounter some of the most valuable goods and obligations which appear to be so innately so given. As David Brain notes, the human being is a self-reflective animal. If he considers the essential elements in family relationships, he will observe that parents, by their genes, give shape to their children, and they are also the efficient causes or productive agents in respect of the children, and that they also provide the initial material from which the child grows up. In addition, the mother's womb is the initial context of the child's growth, and the household, or home, is typically the context of the child's nurture and much of its education. Immediately, on this picture, questions of the common good become fundamental, in a way they can't be for a view of man that is radically dualistic and individualist, and at the political level assumes a kind of liberal androgyny as its paradigm. Now, before saying anything more about gender theory, it may be well to look briefly at the notion of the common good and the family that exists to promote and protect it. St. Thomas says, "The common good is the end of individual persons living in a community, as the good of the whole is the end of each and every part." And as the writer Patrick Riley puts it, as with the whole and the parts, the well-being of society redounds to the well-being of each member. In fact, the well-being of each depends on the society, civil and familial, in which all live. Because the good of the part is necessary to the good of the whole, every member of a society is able to refer to his own good and to the good common to all the members. The family is a form of friendship, and as such is a part, in fact an absolutely crucial constituent, of society. The family is a natural or fundamental group unit, the very first human society. It is often referred to as something more fundamentally human than civil society, insofar as it is seen as the foundation for society. It is in this sense pre-political and is grounded in basic human needs, which is not to say that it does not also refer to wider social groupings for which children are being prepared. The thinker David Crawford rightly notes that the family reveals the identity and nature of the person who is the subject and doer of justice. The family is an ordering principle of justice, in the sense that it is inscribed in the identity and structure of the human person, who, precisely as corpore et anima unus, is the subject of moral action and virtue. It is on this basis that the family is an ordering principle of political and legal institutions that codify and instantiate legal justice. If juridical forms and civil institutions are not to be alienating and fragmenting, they need to anticipate and support the concrete person as he really is, rather than a hypothetical and denatured person. The family is the foundation of justice and is antecedently organic to society, in the sense that it informs the nature of the person who is, or should be, presupposed by those institutions. Now, this is not to prioritize in any obvious way the status of the family. The family is part of a much larger network of relationships, And of course the family must respect the just requirements of civil society, which should, however, be built around respect for its fundamental group unit, the family. On this subject it is worth noting, and citing the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, where the family should serve as a model for society, since it avoids the extremes of both individualism and collectivism through its attention to the person. And it is particularly apt as a model because the experience of a child is one that is naturally deeply rooted in the love of parents. Thus, love declares to the child that even before his existence, as a subject of love in his own right, his presence was implied and somehow at least tacitly acknowledged in the hope and mystery of the parent's own love. It is therefore the ground in which familial love as a whole can spread its roots. The experience of being someone's child gives us a prehistory necessary to see life as fundamentally good and even destined to exceed the finite bounds of the original family. Now, unsurprisingly, political theorists have attempted to reshape the family according to their own notions, not least when they assume that free, rational individuals are the people around whom a voluntarist, non-teleological political order must be founded. The move to reimagine the family in individualized terms and reshape marriage in terms of dissoluble contracts reveals how political theory, for hundreds of years now, has seen the family as a problem, something to be demystified and, in its traditional form, undermined. The idea that the family is the natural unit of society to which other human associations are added has largely given way, in political theory, to the idea of the family as a contractual relationship of free, rational beings which occupies no special position in modern liberal theory. For people like my own country's John Locke, interested in his two treatises on government in promoting liberal toleration and social consensus among free and rational men, the political order must be constructed upon premises respecting that truth about individuals. As Philip Abbott asks, if we are free, rational, equal, and independent, how can we explain relationships of emotion and dependency separate from consent? The family is, on this view, a problem which needs to be reconfigured in line with the contract model of a rational, individualistic order. Moving toward the present, we see that John Rawls, in his A Theory of Justice and subsequent works, argues for a social contract theory which imagines people standing in an original position behind a veil of ignorance, bereft of everything which makes them human, except that which seeks for a social and political consensus acceptable to all. What people can be persuaded to accept as good becomes what the determinant of what is good. On this Kantian approach to political philosophy, and I say Kantian, I don't wish to be unfair to Immanuel Kant, who should not necessarily be thought of as agreeing with this, based entirely on rights and relying on no comprehensive theory of the good, the family becomes something contingent and secondary, rather than the natural foundational unit of society, from which our conception of moral reality and justice is necessarily born. For Rawls's theory seems to demand that the family cannot even enter into the basic structure of society, to which his principles of distributive justice apply. He thereby separates out the family from the political order. Well, we are now seeing the logical outcome of this kind of political philosophy through the enactment of genderless or same-sex marriage legislation, which treats the rational, free individual as one without sexual capacities or roles related to them. What now do the terms husband, wife, father, mother amount to? Some have declared, following the logic of advocates of transgenderism and gender theory, that the latter two roles should be renamed father and mother, progenitor 1 and progenitor 2. In fact, this came into being with Spanish government forms a number of years back. So what I've referred to as fundamental roles connected to a clear telos, that's acting towards an end, a purpose, offences of which are, on the face of it, given the fundamental nature of that telos, more serious than most. So going against that telos, I think, is more serious in this area because of the fundamental goods at stake. They are now hollowed out at the level of law. Those things that are given, like our maleness and femaleness, and all the fundamental relational aspects that go with them, have no place in what appears in some way a logical consequence of the liberalism just described. This rejection of logos, telos, is nicely expressed in the life and works of a hero of the genderists, Michel Foucault, who helpfully sums up the trajectory of this approach when he urged us to, quote, free ourselves from cultural conservatism. We must see our rituals for what they are, completely arbitrary things tied to our bourgeois way of life. It is good to be dirty and bearded, to have long hair, to look like a girl when one is a boy, and vice versa. One must put in play, show up, transform, and reverse the system that quietly orders us about. As far as I'm concerned, that is what I do in my work. And he added, the unity of society should not be considered except as something to be destroyed. Consistently, he approached his demise from AIDS, advocating to those who asked his guidance suicide orgies within which to dissolve themselves. And that's a quote. Behind all this, and underlying the political paradigm I've mentioned, is a dualistic view of man. Just as the family is relegated to secondary and contingent place in the political order, the sexual body is reduced to a secondary and contingent place, subservient to the will of the owner. Now, there was a time when the notion of self-ownership was treated as an absurdity, ownership being a term only properly applied to property. However, the view which treats as ethically irrelevant biological facts about human nature is one which derives from the idea that, as Brain has it, in any account of man, reference to the human being as such, one might say as a whole, can be eliminated in favour of reference to parts and their interrelations. Typically, those taking this view distinguish, so this is the dualist view, they distinguish an inner part, the inner man, whether this be conceived as a non-material entity, a mind or a soul, or whether it be identified with the brain, as the materialist would, and an outer part, the aggregate of man's bodily parts, or of the rest of those parts apart from the brain, the outer man, whose behaviour we observe in speech and action. The inner mind of man, whether or not identified with the brain, is then being conceived as governing the outer man, as a mind governing or using or administering a machine, like a train driver or something. Now, the roots of such a view, whether dualism or materialism, can be seen in Descartes' attempt to free thought from the empirical and in Kant's transcendental ego, though I do note that Kant, in his writing on sexual ethics, does make heavy use of teleology. We might also mention Jean-Paul Sartre's rejection of a human essence, together with his existentialist nausea in the confrontation of an ungrounded radical freedom and nature. Sartre rejects the idea of a fixed human nature and essence, for he held that sense can only be made of the idea if human natures are understood as ideas in the mind of God, as in traditional theism. Sartre, for whom rejection of God is fundamental to his worldview, throws out fixed human nature too, not seeing that we can have an immanent understanding of the reality of a fixed human nature, or indeed of the laws of physics, before we come to argue about God. Even those who wish to deny the place of the body in ethics, as a matter of fact, cannot escape the functionality of our bodies. Despite the term gender now being used to refer to sexual concepts in a specifically non-procreative, reproductive way, and not polar differential sense, male-female, the reality of sexual differentiation and its meaning cannot be escaped. I think the previous talk showed that fairly clearly. While transgenderism is at the forefront of denying the significance and functionality of the sexual organs, in other areas of bodily health and functioning, its exponents share the same assumptions as anyone else. They do, after all, use doctors and medical knowledge for conventional purposes. Whatever theories we come up with, it is in fact the case that genderless marriage and other same-sex unions which presuppose homosexual activity use reproductive organs. So they depend on sexual polarity for their very existence. We wouldn't have these organs if it wasn't for sexual differentiation. So in order to have homosexual sex or other forms of sex like that, you rely on this polarity. Well, the same is true of the reproductive technologies with which same-sex unions are sometimes accompanied. It is only through the exploitation of one, or often two, women, the ovum, the egg provider, and the surrogate mother, that two men will obtain a child to whom one at least will be paternally related. Leaflets produced for same-sex couples to use when explaining their origin to their children avoid the use of the term donor and present a relentlessly positive picture of what is going on. Again, the use of donor sperm or ova by transgender and or same-sex couples co-opts reproductive polarity, male-female differentiation. It cannot escape it. Even in the case of transgender individuals, the drive to reproduce sometimes trumps the desire to complete gender reassignment. And this is a real example of a woman who wishes to be a man while delaying completing her surgery until she has given birth to a child. In a bizarre twist, the transgender woman may deal with her situation by seeing herself as a social father, or father-to-be, strangely bonded to a female animal. In fact, her own female self. Just as abortion culture pathologizes pregnancy, here too, though in a less lethal way, natural human teleology fails to be seen and appreciated for what it is. And we must not forget, contraception and sterilization, that is, activity aimed at changing a unitive procreative kind of act into something sterile and necessarily disunitive. Now, such acts eliminate the very end of the striving found in genuine marital sex, even sex which on some particular occasion may be fertile. In denying the nature of the conjugal act, contraception and sterilization are actually the first step in removing the sexual differentiation and complementarity, paving the way for gender ideology. The woman's bodily and holistic nature is, after all, nullified to some extent, for example, by the choice to use the pill. Now, it might be objected that a transsexual is not denying his biological sex, but rather making a claim about his mental states, which is, he might say, both necessarily true, I feel like a man, and unalterable. To this there are several ripostes. To begin with, many, though not all transsexuals, want surgery to make their bodies fit what they feel they are or should be. In other areas, such as anorexia nervosa, we do not regard the patient's own view of how their body should be as conclusive. Both our mental and our physical faculties are oriented towards ends that should be respected. Our minds should fit the real world. To focus only on the mind, as the state does when it treats equivalently a transsexual who has had surgery and a transsexual who has not had surgery, and someone who simply accepts his or her sex, is to reduce maleness and femaleness to something that no longer has intrinsic features that it had before. So just as genderless marriage degrades the state's recognition of all marriage, marriage is redefined for everybody, so state promotion of transgenderism degrades sexual differentiation. It's changed for everybody as well. Indeed, degrades everybody's inherent bodily sex. But more fundamentally, if a person is seeking, whether via surgery or simply via cross-dressing or public perceptions to identify as the other sex, surely that other sex must ultimately be identified in reproductive terms. Again, we are forced back to the facts of biology. The cross-dressing man seeks to identify with characteristics historically associated with the sex that has babies. He is not merely dressing at random. In the case of sex change, the very notion of change presupposes some reference from and into which the person changes. Reference which ultimately, even if at one remove, relate to male or female reproduction, though this connection may not be immediately obvious. Interestingly, people identifying as transgender have often in the past opted for mutilating operation to allow them to resemble their chosen or real sex. Now, however, as we have seen with the whistleblower in America, Bradley Manning, there are moves to change sex, in his case to a woman, Chelsea Manning, and be recognized as having changed without the need of any painful operations. And there is no logical reason why someone can't change sex from day to day or even from second to second. This is perfectly logical if the meaning of the body is sufficiently downgraded along the lines that I've outlined. Well, just as I come to the end, I'll say a few things about England. Now, David Cameron's government in Britain vigorously championed genderless, that is same-sex, marriage, and pushed through this major legislation in the most undemocratic and underhand way. It was not even announced in their election manifesto that they were going to do this, and to establish it as the norm of civil marriage in England. Cameron once famously declared himself the heir to Blair, showing, if it needed to be shown, that the so-called right and left in British politics share the fundamental assumptions often not shared by many voters. Tony Blair, whose government paved the way for such changes, was advised by Professor Anthony Giddens, an eminent sociologist who, taking seriously ideas such as a purely affectional view of marriage, that is, one emptied of the procreative element and ideas of lifelong union bound up with that element, takes the thought one step further and suggests, in the word of sociologist Patricia Morgan, an affectional conception of parenthood. Quote, where adults, so this idea of parenthood is as follows: adults acquire obligations to children separated from their own intimate lives. Any notion that people who made the baby are its parents moves aside to accommodate the diversity of personal choice. So your biological connection with children is irrelevant. Now, just to show how insane that is, any woman here who has children, can you imagine you give birth to a child, you're in the hospital, and they come back and they say, well, I'm not sure this is your physical child, we've got a few over there, but you can have this child, okay? Now, if anybody thinks that that's a problem, then I think you think that biological bonds matter. So, where adults acquire obligations to children separated from their own intimate lives, any notion that people who made the baby are its parents moves aside to accommodate the diversity of personal choice. Those who think up the baby, not bear or sire it, are the parents. The removal of traditional bonds, of course, creates a society of atomized individuals, increasingly dependent upon an interventionist and anti-family state, something reflected in the welfare benefits arrangements with regard to married and separated couples in the UK. In the meantime, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, a hugely influential body in British culture, has advised, through a commission study, that children's programming positively, quote, familiarise audiences through incidental portrayal from an early age with homo, bisexuality, and family variations, as well as validate children who are homo, bisexual. Already gay marriage legislation is affecting schools, insofar as a new definition of what marriage is appears to be mandatory for teachers to teach. And that definition, of course, follows from the gender ideology worldview outlined in this talk. Even though a fraction of the population is actually homosexual, something you would never know from watching TV or reading the popular newspapers, and even though a fraction of that fraction is likely ever to have a gay marriage, marriage can no longer be safely taught in schools as it has always held to be. You have to teach marriage as what it now is defined as. England has often held itself to be a highly scientific country, one that was at the forefront of the Enlightenment. One defining feature of Enlightenment thinking was the rejection of the idea of a final cause, something crucial to any understanding of teleology. This is the Aristotelian idea. This was done in the name of science, even though any coherent science must in the end rely on some form of teleology as recognized in laws of nature. That error led many to assume that there was a strict division between so-called facts and values, with, broadly speaking, the former seen as objective and the latter as subjective. And students were consistently taught that one cannot derive a value from a fact. In other words, one couldn't derive from, say, the fact of human nature is a fact, any kind of value or goal and good end. It is not difficult to see how this way of thinking opens the way to the kind of errors found in gender ideology. But the fact-value distinction, and what is sometimes distinguished from it, the is-ought problem, you can't derive an ought from an is, doesn't do what it's supposed to. Once you have a substantial theoretical, that is a disinterested as opposed to action-oriented knowledge, that something is of a certain kind, once you know something is of a certain kind, what that kind of thing is for, and how it is to achieve its goal, then you already know enough to make some claims not only about what it ought to do, how it ought to operate and be like, but also what you or I ought, conditionally of course, to do with it. The last group of ought judgments should certainly count as practical, even if one insists on withholding that classification from the earlier group. As a matter of fact, theoretical knowledge that I'm a physician, so we have physicians in this audience, theoretical knowledge that somebody is a physician already tells us what a physician ought to do. If the above is correct, it is hard to see what the is-ought problem is supposed to be. And of course, there is no justification in claiming without argument that man has no end or function overall as a rational human being, in addition to the value of his healthy, functional aspects, including his reproductive functionality. So if you think of sex as an area where I think functionality is very obvious, there's a very obvious end to our functionality, that's denied by the gender ideology, but they don't deny that for any other aspect of health. Any other aspect of health is seen as obviously purposive, obviously value-laden. Health, including reproductive health, is in fact a good example of something factual, which is already evaluative. You can't separate out. Now, I began by recounting a tragic story of the Belgian transgender person, which at every stage involved the placing of voluntarism, obsession with autonomy, choice, over inherent goodness, ending up with the destruction of a human being, and therefore a destruction of being, which is what the good is all about. Now, I continued by noting the radically social nature of man and sense of belonging. In a curious way, what we have seen with transgendered activists, not to mention gay rights activists, is a desire not only to reshape their bodies and or sexual activities, but also to reshape the very institutions that recognize the teleology of sexual organs and sexual desires, most obviously marriage. Note, however, that both groups will also insist that they are essentially like that, essentially gay or essentially transgendered or whatever, and that being like that is not a matter of choice, after all. Now, such a position, which was less widely held in the early days of gay activism, where the stress was on choice, that I could choose to be hetero or homosexual, clearly struggles in an essentialism of convenience. I think it has a political purpose, aside from anything else, but essentializes what it makes essential is a disorder, which cannot itself be part of an essence. A true essence cannot be essentially disordered, okay? And society, according to these people, must be made to recognize these self-perceptions at all costs for people whose sense of identity depends upon it. That identity, based in an oppositional attitude to a human biological nature with an inherently good end of human flourishing, not to mention a further transcendent one, can never be at peace with itself. Any humane society must look to the wisdom of the ages and to where we came from if it is to discover the meaning of sex, sexual differentiation, and the bonds that prevent us from becoming narcissistic. And it must do that to nurture love and hope. Thank you.